All right, we're back. And I totally forgot to hit record. So that first part of the lecture is not being recorded and will not be on the cloud. So I apologize for that. I need to put a yellow sticky up here to remind myself to do that. But the second part will be. Okay, where are we? A couple minutes late. All right, so let's pick up and continue here with global demographics. So step back for a minute, again, just to reiterate what we said at the outset, right? That our population growth has been extraordinary. And what I've done here is just try to draw this on a couple of different, or to look at global numbers from through a couple of different lenses here. So you can see by 1920, we come out of World War II, we're approaching 2 billion people. And here we are at 2011, we go through 7 billion people. That's why the first slide in this set of lectures is called 7 billion and beyond. It was a really interesting National Geographic publication when we went through 7 billion. Predictions are, these numbers change a little bit depending on how growth rates change around the world. The predictions are that we will probably be at about 8.5 to 8.6 billion by the end of 2030. 9.2 billion by 2040, and the United Nations puts us at about 9.7 by 2050, and maybe through 10 to 10.5 billion people by the end of the century. We're going to look at some of the things that might impact and affect how these numbers play out, right? So, yep, an extraordinary century and a bit of population growth. Another way to look at it, just to give you a geographic one. So this diagram shows the world, and again, we're coming back to 2011 because that was the 7 billion mark. It shows global countries in 1960, so just before I was born, just south of about 3 billion people. Each dot here, each of these little white dots represents 2 million people, so you don't see nations that had populations smaller than that. And here we are in 2011, right? That map fills out, and you can see just sort of color coded in terms of percentage growth rate. So we go back to 1960 and we come up through to 2011. And you can see that if, and I'll go back just one more time, and we look at, say, for example, Europe, the boundaries of Europe, the boundaries of the United States don't really extend very much. But of course, when you look at Africa, South Asia, in other words, India, Southeast Asia, parts of Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on, and of course, East Asia, including China, that's where the population growth is pretty dramatic. Another way to look at it, in terms of population growth, is to express this in terms of population densities, the number of people per square kilometer, right? So yeah, the eastern seaboard of the United States is fairly dense, parts of Western Europe. But when you look again at that South Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and East Asia, China, Japan in particular, the Philippines, and so on, that's where the population pressures, and in terms of density, are very high. We're going to come back and link some of this, another one of these themes that as we go through this course, everyone, we're going to link this to things like deforestation, right? We're going to look at that, we're going to look at biodiversity. You know, think about this as another way to look at the population density map. There are more people living inside this circle than out of it. And I always think that's a pretty extraordinary diagram or way to think of it. And so the inevitable rise of China, which has, of course, happened and happening, the inevitable rise of India, one of my favorite countries in the world, and what that means in terms of resources and food and environment, and energy consumption, and so on, right? So that's just a global picture, right? Now, when we talked about rate of natural increase, remember I said if you're looking at the doubling time of a population, it's all based on what growth rates are doing, right? And growth rates are changing, okay? And Matt made this comment, Matt, you made this in your question about family size. So we're going to start coming back and unpacking that, right? Growth rates are changing, and what is directly tied to the growth rate is this new little expression or index, which is the total fertility rate, right? The total fertility rate. It's kind of a I suppose in some ways a bit of a misunderstood index, but critically important. So TFR, total fertility rate, is the number of births on average, okay, that a woman would be expected to have over her lifetime, and expected to have in terms of the UN defines childbearing years as 15 to 49, right? So there's fewer in the 15s and fewer in the 49s and much more in the middle, but that's the official child producing years for a woman. So the total fertility rate is the number of births that would be expected on average for a woman during her lifetime at a particular moment in time, right? It's a very dynamic index. It changes, and of course, it plays out directly in terms of the rate of natural increase, because it's the index that affects the birth rate. So when we look at this little diagram, I've tried to summarize this, okay, and we're gonna start looking at this in a bit more detail now. But if we just go back to 1950, 1955, that first 5 years, right? We come out of the Great Acceleration. The global TFR was 4.95. In other words, every woman on the planet was having, on average, almost 5 kids over her lifetime, right? And that's a global average, okay? You can see how that begins to drop, and we move through the 1970s, okay? And the current TFR, it's actually just below 2.5. It's probably closer to around about 2.39 to 2.4 at the moment, if we come around to 2021. They haven't got the 21 numbers. But the point here is global total fertility rates are now, on average, less than 2.5, okay? And this is the critical TFR globally. The replacement TFR is 2.1, right? In other words, for a population to just replace itself, women should have, on average, 2.1 kids over their lifetimes, right? For a population to replace itself. Why is it 2.1? Why is it not 2.0 for a population to replace itself, right? Man and a woman, and they each have, and the woman has 2 kids, man and woman die, those kids are replacing the mom and dad. That's what the replacement total fertility rate means. Why is it 2.1, do you think?
Is it because of gender?
That's an interesting comment. I don't know how that, I have to think about how that plays into it. Let me say for the moment, no, but no with an asterisk. I'm gonna have to come back and think about that, Claire. Keep going though.
Is it because just like people may die randomly? Like there's variability in how, like when people go.
So, yeah, infant mortality, IM, right? We have infant mortality, tragically. So babies die, either under the age of 1, or the UN also looks at the number of deaths under the age of 5, okay? Good observation, Jet. What else? What else would play into the fact that you got to have 2.1 kids and not 2? Matt, you raised it in your framing of the question yesterday, I think. Choice, right? Some people just choose to have 1. I was one and done, right? We popped him out. Well, not we, that's the royal we. Liam made an appearance, fantastic kid. We're done, right? Some people choose to have none. Some people cannot have kids, right? So the global TFR is not 2, it's technically right at 2.1 for the global population to replace itself. Here's where things get really interesting, right? The UN projects, I suppose, that total fertility rates will fall below 2 as we begin to approach the end of the century, and that by 2100 they should be well below 2.1, probably somewhere in the region of 1.9 to 1.95. What do you think that means? What is the implication of a TFR of 1.95 globally?
Does that mean that we're in the period of the overshoot, and that they're predicting that we're going to have a dieback?
Interesting. Hadn't thought of it in those terms. No, but
Is it we have a declining population?
yeah, which is I suppose is tied into your comment, man. Right? Once you have dieback, your population is going down. Yeah, if your total fertility rate, good, Jet, if your total fertility rate falls below 2.1, your population is declining. It's a shrinking population. As soon as your total fertility rate is above 2.1, your population over the longer period is growing, right? Because it's a replacement number. Oh, excuse me, it's a replacement number. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. So from a resource perspective, this looks like tremendous news, okay? And if we think about an S curve, population's done this, it's done this, we're at 7 or 8, 9, 9.5. It looks like that by 2100, we should be somewhere here, right? Somewhere where we are reaching, or perhaps are now on the decline, but somewhere in here, we reach what is known as zero population growth, ZPG, okay? As soon as those total fertility rates fall below 2.1, then we're starting to see populations decline, right? So from a resource perspective, just simply from a resource perspective, that looks like good news. And that's an incredible decline since 1970s. And we'll come back and explore some of the reasons for that in just a little bit as pertaining to Matt's question yesterday. So that's the good news. Here's part of the challenge, and perhaps the major challenge, right? 85% of the growth in our global population from here on out to 2100. So we're at 7.8 billion, 8.5 billion, 9.2. If let's say we get to 9.5 billion, right? Or let's say by 2100, we get to 10.8 to 10.9 billion, right? That growth is coming predominantly from sub-Saharan Africa, okay? That's extraordinary. So we are currently at let's say 7.7-ish. The UN says we may well be at 10.9 billion people by 2100. So in other words, that's where we've come up with 3.2 billion new people, right? Think about that. 3.2 billion new people on the planet. That's as many people as were on the planet when I was born, right? So, I mean, that's got to mean something from a number of different avenues. The point on this diagram is that of that 3.2 billion, 2.7 are coming from sub-Saharan Africa, okay? What's the challenge there? Why would we stop here and go, what are the implications?
Lack of infrastructure and resources.
Mm-hmm. Yep, okay. A lack of infrastructure and resources. I don't know how many of you were around at the break when Jacob framed his question so nicely about climate refugees, right? A lot of these parts of the world are, let's just say they are uncomfortable from an environmental perspective, right? Sometimes really hot, heat waves, drought, famine, water resources are an issue, resources period are an issue, right? Now we're going to add 2.7 billion people from that particular region. They're going to want food, they're going to want water, they're going to want energy for sure. And they are absolutely or fully deserving of a life of dignity. And a lot of them are going to be looking at Western lifestyles and saying, I want some of that, right? And that is going to be a challenge. Here's another way to try and look at this. I'm just going to give you some different looks here at how to kind of take a step back and think about this global population. So this is, I've taken this from a different paper and tried to redraw this in, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but this inside circle, the solid little green circle here is the world's population in 1950. Okay, so we had 2.5 billion people in 1950. And in North America in 1950, we had 173 million. In Europe, we had 549 million in 1950. In Africa, it's estimated that we had about 228 million, right? That's how I've tried to draw this. I'm never going to ask you the details of a diagram like this on an exam, right? The bigger circle, the more transparent one, shows the predicted populations in 2100. So Africa goes from 228 million to 4.3 billion, right, over that time period. The inevitable rise of Africa. And that's going to pose challenges. It's also going to be a good thing given the human capital that is there. Asia goes from 1.4 to 4.7 billion, pretty extraordinary. You can see Europe is going to go from 549 to 630 million. Okay, these are estimates, and of course things like, as Jacob articulated, things like climate, refugees, and immigration and movement are all going to play out into this, right? But this is what the current kind of demographic consensus is that we're moving towards 10.9 billion people by the end of 2100, which I think is quite an extraordinary statistic. These are the world's most populous countries in 2100. So currently China is the world's most populous country. India will take China over sometime in the very near future. I think it's estimated to happen certainly within the next few years. China will have something like India will have something like 1.42 billion people, right? So 1,400 million on the axis here is the same as 1.4 billion. You can see how India and China will account for 25% of the world's population. The United States will be fourth, just over 400 million, right? Look at the countries here: India, China, Nigeria, Pakistan, DRC, Indonesia, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Egypt. Interesting. I thought of another way to try and show. You'll get the sense, guys, that I like diagrams, right? So here's another way to try and think about population, okay? And I've just tried to show this from 2019, 2050, and 2100, right? To show you just how dynamic global growth really is, right? So in 2019, China was the most populous country in the world, 1.4 billion people, right? This is population size in millions, 1,434 million. So that's 1.4 billion people. By 2050, India will be the most populous. By 2100, India will be the most populous. But just look at these numbers here. Actually, let me just get the annotate on for a second here. I think it's pretty interesting. When you look at India, India's population goes from 1.6 billion to 1.4. China's goes from 1.36 billion in 2019 to just at 1 billion. China's population is on the decline. And the arrows here, I've tried to indicate those populations that are rising and those populations that are going down. Look at Russia, the Russian Federation. In 2019, Russia had 146 million people. By 2050, that will be 136 million. By 2100, they're off the top 15. They don't even rate, right? The mustard arrows are the ones that are going to experience great growth. Ethiopia, DRC, Nigeria, India, for example, okay? Egypt between 2050 and 2100. So again, just another way to look at this and to begin thinking about what are the implications from a kind of resource environmental perspective. Any thoughts or comments on that? Questions? Anything surprise you on this list? Look at Bangladesh. I think that's quite interesting. If you just look at Bangladesh here for a minute, the 8th highest population in the world in 2019, 163, 193, 151. By 2100, Bangladesh will have less people than they have today, right? And Matt, your ears should be dinging here about those questions that you raised. Why? What's going on? Cultural and so on, which we will look at in just a little bit. All right, cool. Again, much of this is premised on what the growth rates will do, right? We talked about a changing R, a changing population growth rate. So these projections that I've just given you, the ups and downs and where countries are going to be, are based on what the United Nations, the Food and Agriculture Administration, and various nonprofits, they talk about what are the global growth rates likely to do over the next 45 or so years, right? So they look at what the rate of natural increase, okay, the average annual growth rates in population will look like. So currently, the global growth rate is about 1.09%, something like that, right? That equates to a total fertility rate of about 2.49. The projections is that the global growth rates are going to continue to decrease, and over the next 35 to 45 years, will average about 0.76. But of course, there's enormous disparity between more developed regions and less developed regions. And here's the big one, right? Africa and Asia. Over the next 45 years, growth rates in Africa will still be above 1%, right? 1.72%. Total fertility rates above 2.1. Right? Europe has a shrinking population. Okay, there's been some really interesting dynamics when you look at populations. Let's just see, two countries come to mind: Italy and Ireland. Okay? Italy and Ireland have seen declining populations, right? And there's obviously a birth control and a religious overprint here. But Italy and Ireland have seen declining populations over the last 20 or 30 years. And, 50 years ago, there were campaigns to reduce population from a resource perspective. Now there's campaigns to increase populations, right? And we've seen that in China. I'm going to mention China in just a little bit when we look at the one-child policy and how that came into play. And now that's off the table. And now they're encouraging people to have more than one child, and how the tables have turned on something like a state-controlled population. Another little graphic for you before we move on. I tried to just kind of summarize the scenario of global growth. I don't know if this works or not, but let's see. I've tried to summarize this by looking at the 5 countries in Africa and Pakistan as well as the 6th country here. These 6 countries will account for 50% of the world's population increase in 2100. Okay, and each of these countries is scaled more or less proportionately to the United States. So more or less, there's the US, and here are the actual size of these countries. And each of these little squares that I've drawn on here, okay, represents 10 million people. So what am I trying to show here? Well, if you just spend a minute and look at this, in 2020, Tanzania, right, which is right next to Kenya, Mount Kilimanjaro, Tanzania has a population of 60 million as at the end of last year, according to their Census Bureau. At the end of this century, that will be 286, a mere 370% increase in their population. Okay? Their government's going to have some difficult decisions, for sure. Okay, so the percentages here just show a relative increase from high to left, right? And Pakistan, Jacob, when you look here, 221 million will be 403 million by 2100. Okay, so very, very complex picture of potential population growth. I don't know if anybody has any comments or thoughts on that, but I think those are quite interesting to see where the real pressure points will be from a population perspective.
Do you think that because of the fact that most of these countries are located in Africa, that there's going to be like world pressure of an influx of finance and resources dumped into the country? So there's already chaos, but that there's not an absolute like catastrophic event.
Oh, I don't know, Matt. That's an interesting one. We look at, and it's so fascinating because of course I'm from there, and so I look at it from 2 accounts, right? I look at it from being an American citizen and everything that this country entails, and so many things that I take for granted, and all of that. And then I look at it through the lens when I go home of, okay, so I'm still South African, and I know I'm much more familiar with Southern Africa rather than the countries that you see on the screen here in Central and Sub-Saharan Africa. But I agree with you. These are countries that okay, they've come out of a long legacy of colonialism, and some people would argue there's been lots of positive there, and some people would argue there's been lots of negative. That's not my place to make those judgment calls. But the reality is, you've got large populations for traditional cultural reasons. They've had large families. They've been rural societies. You need lots of people to work the farms. They've had high infant mortality, so people have lots of kids to replace their families and so on. All of those sort of cultural things that have happened over time. And now you've got these countries that are going, okay, now we want to develop, right? We want to be part of the global stage. And as you'll see in a minute, Matt, there's a reason why 10 billion is inevitable. Right? No matter what we do, no matter how many resources we dump into a particular region, 10 billion people is inevitable, right? So this raises lots of interesting ethical questions. What do we, i.e., what do we in the quote unquote West do here? Do we sit back and pour resources in, or do we say, we've got enough trouble on our own doorstep here in terms of resources and climate change and so on? It's going to be complicated. I don't have an easy answer to your question, honestly, and I'm not trying to duck it. I just think it's going to be a very, very complex mixture. On the other hand, you look at countries like Rwanda. I haven't been there, right? Rwanda comes out of this dreadful genocide in the 1990s, they are flying. Their economy is growing by 6 to 8% per year. Infrastructure is developing, massively successful. Now they don't have the population scale, that the DRC has or Nigeria has, for example. There's also, of course, massive inequality in the distribution of wealth, right, in these countries. So it's a really complex picture, I think. Yeah. Here's why 10 billion is inevitable. Okay. It's inevitable because of the age structure of the global population as it currently stands, right? And again, Matt, this will come back to your question. So let me show you. This may seem like a little silly animation, but here's why it's inevitable. In full transparency, I love Legos. So does my wife. So we build Legos. We bought each other Legos for our anniversary. How nerdy, right? So I'm going to use Lego bricks here as an example. So let's look at the global population, okay? And each one of these Lego bricks, and I'm gonna use as the starting point 2011, when we went through 7 billion people, right? Each one of these Lego bricks represents about 1 billion people, more or less, okay? And in 2011, we had 2 billion people on the planet in the age group of 0 to 15 years, okay? So 2 billion out of the 7 billion, right? I'm not a great mathematician, but that's round about 1/3, are kids, okay? Then we had another 2 billion in the age bracket of 15 to 30 years, and another billion in the age bracket of 30 to 45 years, another billion in the bracket of 45 to 60. So there I am in the green. And then we had another billion in the bracket 60 years plus. So that's 7 billion people, and more or less at a broad brushstroke, how the global population was divided in terms of age group, right? Well, here's the challenge, okay? The challenge is we now move towards 2100, okay? And what happens? Well, people age. This is one problem with the current model. The purple people at some point are going to disappear, right? So that billion or so in the purple, not overnight, of course, but eventually over a period of time, they will die and everybody begins to age and move up into different age brackets. And the red Lego bricks and the mustard Lego bricks, and maybe a few out of the blue Lego bricks, are having kids, right? Those are the child producing years. And remember, the global total fertility rates at the moment are about 2.49, okay, on average, meaning people are having more than the replacement level, right? So they all move up into the older brackets, and another 2 billion come along, okay, in the 0 to 15. You can kind of see where this is going. Eventually, the purples begin to age and die off. Everybody shifts up and move up, and the childbearing years produce another 2 billion, and so on, until eventually, by the time we get to 2100, we have a global population that looks like this, of 10 billion people, almost completely independent of what we may be able to do right now because of the global age structure, if that makes sense. I know that's kind of a crude illustration, but that's why we are inevitably marching towards 10 billion, right? Even if total fertility rates right now at this particular moment just went to 2.1, boom, we would be somewhere in the 10 billions by the end of the century. So age structure is another important demographic construct that we look at. And here's just an example, right? Age structure diagrams, these used to be called population pyramids. It's a bit misleading, population pyramids. So the way in which these age structure diagrams, and there's lots of resources online you can look at for various regions and countries, you take a population, okay, the total population, and you split that population out into the number of males and the number of females in various age groups, right? So the reds here are the 0 to 15s, the oranges are the 15s to 45s, okay? Technically the child producing years, and the mustard colored gold ones here are post-child production, okay? Boys on the left, girls on the right, if that makes sense. And so the age structure diagram will give you a quick sense as to what that population is likely to do in the coming years. This does look like a pyramid, right? And a country that has a population or an age structure diagram that looks like that is going to grow rapidly. Why? Because when these kids move up into the child producing years and they have kids, the base of that population is much broader, right? There's more of those youngsters that will move up, and those youngsters will then have kids. So that's a rapidly expanding population. This is a stable population where the ages are more or less evenly distributed. And then there's a declining population, right? Where you've got a larger proportion of older people. Okay, Japan is a great example of that. Japan, they have their life expectancy is very, very long. I think they genetics and they eat healthy and so on, but they've got a declining population. They've got an aging population. And I think what's really interesting here is when you look at different countries, and I'm just going to use two here, right? When you look at the United States versus India, for example. So here's the US on the right. So I've taken the data from the census and I've broken them up into the age groups. So here's 0 to 15. So that's the 15, and here's 15 to 45 right in there, right? So this light outer area here was the population diagram for the US in 2010, okay? There's the baby boomers. You can just see the little bulge there, okay? And here is the 2050, the slightly darker one. And you look at the US on the right and India on the left. There's India in 2010 with a rapidly expanding population, a broader base, but India's population age structure diagram in 2050 looks remarkably like the US, okay? And so that's why when you start looking at these countries moving into the next few decades, and certainly 2050 and beyond, that's when population starts slowing down, total fertility rates start approaching 2.1, and the age structure diagrams of these various countries as a whole start maturing, if that's the right phrase. I'm not sure that it is, but they start looking much more like a stable population. And of course, some countries, the ones that are rapidly growing, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, do not look like this. They still have a large base. So yeah, the world is getting older, right? The world is aging. This is the median age of the world population. You can see by 2022, 23, the median age of the world's population will be 31. By 2100, it'll be 42, right? So people are getting older and older. And that has implications in terms of not just life expectancy, but looking after people much longer, what that does to things like Social Security and social services. And then where do the young people come along to keep both the culture and the economies of the world's population going? Jacob asked an interesting question just before the break about refugees and climate refugees. So I thought this isn't necessarily a climate refugee diagram, but I thought I'd show you this. I put this in the book as well, just to get us thinking about those countries that have the largest number of immigrants as it relates to high or middle income. So this looks like a pretty complicated diagram. So here's how I've drawn it. We've got per capita income on the bottom, right? So these are very low income countries, $150 per capita per year. I know it's a funky kind of logarithmic scale, $3,000 here, $8,000 here, $20,000 here, high income countries over here, right? So you've got wealth on the bottom and millions of people on the top. So this is zero over here. Anything up here is positive immigration into that country. Anything down here is immigration out of that country, right? I don't know if I've completely messed up this diagram as an explanatory tool, but see if you can figure out what we're trying to get across here. Okay, here's the United States, highest number of immigrants, right? And this is, I should have just pointed that out. So when you look at the title here, this is for the last decade, right? So between 2014 and 2018, you remember that diagram earlier, the United States had about 8 million people. Over the decade, we've got about 10 million people. Germany, United Kingdom, and Canada, right? These are the high influx countries of immigrants. Wealth is certainly a part of that, right? But what else do you see here, everybody? What else jumps out here when you look at this diagram? There's some interesting things going on here, I think. What's going on here? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Mary.
Like wealth and like geographical location are like kind of similar, and like where people are moving to and moving out of.
Okay, yep, absolutely. Right, wealth, Germany.
all the countries that you've listed that are like high growth rates that are expanding, everyone's being born there, but they're not staying there. Like,
okay, good. Now look at these countries and just think about what's going on. Why is Lebanon such a hotbed of immigration? Is it the Lebanese economy? And I don't mean that in a disparaging way whatsoever.
No, it could be the political conflict surrounding Lebanon that's forcing immigrants there.
Excellent, Ahmad. From down here, right?
Syria.
Yep, from Syria. So there is absolutely a refugee component to this, right? For sure. Let me circle these ones here, right? This is a part of the world that I just love. So Nepal, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India, net emigration. Anybody got any thoughts there? Size of the circles give you the scale of the population.
It's hot there. There's a lot of people, and there's not like the resources are in infrastructure and political conflicts between, within and between those countries.
Okay.
Force a lot of people out.
Okay.
I would agree, maybe because of the Islamic or conflict that's forcing migration.
Right. So there's conflict.
disparity of wealth between classes.
Disparity of wealth. Yeah. There's also something really interesting. Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India. There's a brain drain as well from places like this, right? People, these countries are very high on the IT scale, right? So places like India, okay, I can't speak in any informed way about others, India and Nepal, for example. So I'll just give you an example here. We hired a faculty from Nepal who's an incredible guy and a wonderful hydrologist, and I'm working on a consulting case, 2 consulting cases at the moment on flooding, and both the people who are the experts on the hydrologic modeling are from Nepal, right? Very, very high levels of education, well-trained, and they're getting high-paying jobs elsewhere, right? I'm not suggesting there's a massive flood of people out here, but there is a large brain drain from places like that. Labor as well.
There's a couple really good medical schools in Pakistan. I know my grandfather studied at one. He became a heart surgeon in Fort Worth, and his roommate was actually a heart surgeon in California. So I believe, I don't know if this is just my proximity to these people talking, but in my like a anecdotal piece of evidence, but I believe there's like a strong influx of people in the medical field.
So that's really interesting you say that, Jacob, because my wife has a neurologist here in town, and I'm certainly not going to get personal on my family medical history, but the practice, the neurologist, there are 7 of them. Okay, guess where all 7 are from?
India,
Pakistan.
Pakistan.
Yeah, right. So to your point, people that are well-trained, highly educated, specialties are moving around. At the other end of the scale, okay, are people that are going into countries for cheaper labor, right? And this is again, I'm not making a political statement. I'm just making an observation of my experience. I fly a lot, and I fly a lot through the United Arab Emirates and Qatar. I like their airlines. I'm an airline nerd, so I just like their airlines. But when you go through the airports, okay, to a T, most of the people who are operating the duty-free shops, the lounges, are all from that part of the world, right? So there's a really interesting, complicated picture of socioeconomics, geography, conflict, refugees, money. And I guess what I'm getting at is there's push factors and there's pull factors. And we'll come back and see how this plays out from an environmental perspective. Yeah, that's an interesting comment, Jacob. That just made me chuckle when I think of my wife's doctors. And they're all just fantastic. I mean, just top-notch people. Okay, let's keep going. Thanks for those comments. Here's one way to deal with population growth. right? You're probably familiar with this. And that is the one-child policy that was put in place in the late 1970s by the Chinese government. Lots of challenges around this, lots of nuance. You know, people have a significant issue with the government saying, you know what, you can only have one child, and there are significant tax implications if you have two, and there are significant hindrances to education and health and so on and so on. And so I always like to, you know, frame or ask the question whether you have, you know, whether you have any kind of challenge with a one-child policy or not. Was it successful? Well, some people will say, yeah, it was successful, but with the acknowledgement, right, that as China moved out of this kind of very, very focused rural society, the reality is the one-child policy, which went in here, right about here-ish, 1979, this shows total fertility rates, right? So this is in Asia in general. This is not just China. So this is Asia in general. And here's China in the top right in this, and it mimics this graph very, very well, because of course, China is such a dominant player in this part of the world. So the one-child policy goes in 1979, but you can see that the fertility rates were already on the decline from somewhere in the region of 5.5 to 6, right? Children per couple, down to below 4 by the time that the Chinese government implemented the one-child policy. You can only have one child, because they realized that the demographic burden, right, the burden of having these gigantic families would significantly hinder the Chinese economy, okay, and the long-term growth and the impact on resources and pollution and all of the stuff that we're still going to look at, right? And so here we come, so the total fertility rates go down, they go down, they go down. And here we are in 2015, 2016, and the Chinese government begin to make significant modifications to the one-child policy. Actually, to be honest, it may have been a little bit before then, where they said, well, if you're a child that comes from a one-child family, you can have two, right? Now, it's all off. They just disbanded it. There is no more one-child policy. Why? Because they're starting to realize, well, maybe we're running out of human capital to keep this economy and all of this growth going down the line. So I just thought I'd throw that out there as a really important demographic occurrence. So what I want to do here at the end, I'm going to, what do we got? Yeah, we got 10 minutes. So in fact, here I am thinking we'll get through all of population today. We're not. We're going to have to leave food until tomorrow, and I'll spend the first 20 or 30 minutes tomorrow talking about food, but that's okay. But this is a really good point to end. I want to show you two animations. I'm going to get out of the PowerPoint and I'm going to go onto the website. I don't know if anybody has heard of Gapminder. Anybody heard of Gapminder? No one heard of Gapminder. Okay. It's something that, let me just get out of here. It's something that is really, really great. And if you give me a minute, I'm just going to share my screen here. There we go. Okay. Can everybody see that? Okay, cool. All right, I'll probably get a little excited here. I just think this is the coolest website, right? Besides the Golf Channel, this is a really cool website. So what's Gapminder? Okay, so Gapminder is a website that was developed in the 1980s and 1990s by a Swedish guy who was a doctor, but also a statistician. And he wanted to find a way to display data in a very manageable, digestible way, right? And so he started this nonprofit, and eventually it was for profit. And then, of course, eventually it was bought out by Google, like everything else is, and he made a fortune. But it's a very, very cool way to display data. I'll send you the URL. You can go down an absolute rabbit hole here on this website. But I'm going to just do two animations here as it relates to the material this morning on population, right? So here's how this looks. We're going to start in 1800, where just appreciate as you go further back in time, the data is not as robust as it is in 2021, of course. But the two axes here are important. We've got life expectancy on the y-axis, right? How long people live, and the bottom axis is the income. So this is per person, and it's basically GDP per capita. adjusted for inflation. So wealth on the bottom, health on the y-axis, right? How long we live, how wealthy we are. The colors here relate to the region. So green is the Americas, blue is Africa, red is Asia, and yellow, or Asia, Oceania, and yellow is basically Europe. They've redone the colors. I personally don't like them. They used to break them out into much more better regionally. Size of the circles here is population. Okay. And I'm going to let this annotate for a little bit. And I've just pulled out some countries here that I think are quite illustrative. So we're going to look at the US in green, India, right? Ethiopia in blue, Rwanda, and Japan. So the reds are India and Japan. All the little circles behind are the rest of the world. So you'll see this begin to animate here. Okay, let's go. So there goes the dates. And it's kind of like a horse race, and off we go. There's the United States. Let me just pause it there for a second. When things go horizontal, it just probably means there's just not a whole lot of really good data, right? Doesn't mean to say that life expectancy exactly in the United States was 36.4. So there are estimates here, but things start getting a little bit better. So here we go down here, 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. Okay, let me just stop there for a second. So here we are at the turn of the century. We're at 1900, right? India's down here, moving around. Ethiopia's down here. Look at the estimated life expectancies here, less than 30. Okay, life expectancy in the United States here is just over 40, 45-ish. Okay, as you come out of 1900, right? So let's the 20th century run here. Watch what happens as you go through World War I. Is 1900. So we get to World War I, life expectancy. Everybody see that? As you went through World War I, it dipped down, right? I'll just rewind it here. We'll go back a second. So there's 1907, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 16. See that? Everything drops down. So World War I. So we come out of World War I, and here we go. The Roaring 20s, the Great Depression, and we start coming into World War II here. So see where we are in World War II. Okay? The United States here in World War II, you know, life expectancy up here there's the United States highlighted there, right? Life expectancy above 60. Now look what happens to Japan, World War II. Uh-oh, just hang on a second. For some reason, I wonder why I did that. It took the United States out. So let me put the United States back in. There we go. I wonder what's going on here. It's not, I wonder if it's lost the United States. All right. So we'll keep going here. Here's the United States, 55, 57. Look at Japan at the top. Now watch India. India comes out of 1980s, 1990s. Off you go. All right, 2010. And I'm just going to rewind here a little bit. Watch the blues. Watch Rwanda and Ethiopia as I rewind this back here. So we'll go over here, 1970s. So 1970 down here, Ethiopia's life expectancy is in the 40s, Rwanda's is in the 50s. Okay, we fast forward a little bit. Look at this. I'm going to stop here and I'm just going to focus in on Rwanda over here. The little tiny dots of Rwanda. Watch how life expectancy goes down during the genocide. It's pretty remarkable. Life expectancy is Rwanda is 52. We move into the genocide, it goes down. We're now into the 40s again, right? And then we come out of that, and here's Ethiopia and Rwanda, and they are off and running. Life expectancy goes up, and wealth goes up, right? So here's where we are. The United States has a per capita income of something like, 55 to 60,000 per person. Japan up there, pretty extraordinary. Here's India, here's Rwanda. What's the take-home message? We're getting wealthier and we're getting healthier as a globe. Clearly, there are some areas that are very different, right? Somalia has a life expectancy of 59, but only has a 631 GDP, right? But the life expectancy in Somalia at 59 is not far off what the United States was back in the late 1940s, okay? Here's another way to look at it. Right, I'm going to do here the same thing here, and I'll just put it into motion. So here is child mortality. So child mortality is, it's not infant mortality, it's children less than 5 years old that are dying per 1,000. And here's babies per woman. So this is the total fertility rate, right? So I've got a couple of different countries on here. We've still got the United States in green. I've put Mali on here from Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, India, Japan, and Ireland. All right, let's let the horse race go here. And you can imagine what's going to happen here, right? You would expect as we go in, so the US, we don't really have a good idea of what child mortality was, right? So let's just stop there, okay? There's Ireland in yellow, right? So Ireland starts seeing a total fertility rate going down, 1886, infant mortality goes down. Now look at Ireland, 1872, there we are, it's wiggling around, 1900s. 1901. You can see all the world's little dots in the background. 1929, World War II, 1950s. Let's just stop there for a second. What's going on here? The United States. Wait a minute, what's going on here? Total fertility is 2.8, 3.02, 3.7, 3.5. What's going on
right
here?
around the baby boom.
There's the baby boomers, right? There they are, post-World War II baby boomers. You see them there, pretty cool and interesting. Let's keep going. 1960, the baby boomers go, no, we've had enough of that, right? Let's start pulling back. Look what happens here. Let me just pause here for a second. Look what happens here when you just follow. So look at Ireland for a second, right? Ireland, the number of babies here in yellow, there it is there. Ireland's total fertility rate here is 3.99, okay? And a child mortality of 30 in the late 60s, early 70s. Ireland's total fertility rate starts dropping. By the time it gets to 1980, it's 2.9, right? And that's family planning, right? That's birth control, pretty controversial in a Catholic country like Ireland. Look what happens here with Mali. Here's Mali. Mali here has a total fertility rate of 7.15, right? Okay, that's extraordinary. And a child mortality of about 300. In other words, 1/3 of all children under the age of 5 are dying, and people are having 7 or more kids. Now look what happens from 1980s onwards. Look how the left turn takes place in Mali and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And now the horse race starts going all the way down to the left, right? See that? I think it's pretty extraordinary when you look at that and you start thinking about what this means from a global perspective, right? Now, I know we haven't gotten there yet. So Matt, I'm afraid I'm going to leave you and the other questions dangling for just another day, as we're going to start looking a little bit more at the reasons and then tie this into food. The point I want to leave you with, everybody, now I'll end here and then we'll just hang around for 5 minutes if there's any questions. The simple point is that when we look at a course like this and a topic like environmental issues and population growth, there's a whole bunch of good news, right? And the whole bunch of good news is that people are getting healthier, getting wealthier, fertility rates are dropping, birth rates are dropping, you know, obviously access to family planning, clearly the changing roles of women in cultural societies, getting them into education and so on. That's all playing out as really important drivers here, okay? The challenge, the flip side of the good news for me is that as societies develop and they move through this demographic transition, they start developing Western tastes and they start consuming perhaps at Western levels and they start chasing carbon and they want cars, they want refrigerators, electricity, and all of the things that have an environmental footprint that we're going to have to think about as we move forward. So I thought I'd just leave it there. Any thoughts or comments or questions? I finished population comfortably. Any comments? All good. It's a cool website. You can start playing with all these indices and put in your favorite country and send the horse race off. So there's Ireland, for example. Ireland's total fertility at the moment in 2018 is 1.98. It's a shrinking population, right? It's always interesting to put a country like Russia on there. Russia's got a dramatically declining population. Spain, Italy, many countries. Anything else? I'll just do one more quick one here. Singapore is an interesting. Singapore. Let me pull out the DRC. I'm just going to take out some countries here and let's just look at Singapore here. Check out Singapore just for a minute. As we end here, I didn't think about looking at Singapore. The circles are so small because the population is so small. So here's Singapore, high child mortality 5.4. I haven't done this before. Let's just look at what Singapore is. And there's a reason why I've pulled up Singapore here. TFR of 5, 1910, 1920. '50s. Aye. 1980s. That's pretty amazing. 2010s. 2018. There's Singapore. Singapore currently has a TFR of 1.24. It's the second lowest in the world at the moment, next to South Korea, which is another interesting case study, right? So, I mean, that speaks for itself, right? TFR of 6.5 down to 1.25. At 1.25, your population is shrinking by, 50%, something like that. Highly industrialized. Anyway, all right. Any other comments or questions or thoughts before you grab a coffee and head off to lab? All good, all good, all good. I'll hang around quick. So we'll pick up tomorrow. We'll wrap this up. We'll talk about food. And then we're going to, I'll give you the context for energy before we launch into our discussion on fossil fuels and everything like that. All right, everybody, have a great day. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.
You bet.
Did you see my email?
I did. Did you see my reply?
Yes, I saw it, but did you email me again? I couldn't find the discussion post.
So there's no prompt per se. It's just on the Anthropocene lecture.
Oh, okay.
It's on the Anthropocene, yeah. And then it's because it'll be closed, just email it to me. But yeah, there's no prompt. If you when you look at, if you go into the syllabus, at the end of the syllabus, there's a short rubric on how I look at the tweets, and then in the syllabus there's a little bit about what I'm looking for. So it's really just a reflection on that material.
Okay, so I just go to the lecture from yesterday.
Yeah, because were you in the Anthropocene lecture or not? Or
I was here yesterday. Yes.
is that the Anthropocene, or was that before then? No, it'll be the Anthropocene was lecture 1.
Okay.
So just go back and take a quick look at that, and then you can post that. No rush on that.
Okay. Thank you so much.
You bet.
Bye.
Okay.